the last few weeks has taught us anything, it's that we need more women in positions of power, not less. So, when you're choosing Michigan's next Attorney General, ask yourself this: who can you trust most not to show you their penis in a professional setting? Is it the candidate who doesn't have a penis? I'd say so.
Feminism is not the so-called radical idea that women are human, but the far more flattering insistence that they're not. Not if human means capable of evil or just of ordinary meanness, dishonesty, vainglory, greed, malice, or vengefulness. Feminism depends on a fantasy about the angelic nature of womanhood in which both men and women collude. In July of 2018, a mainstream news item identified a trans woman as a man, something punishable in New York State and many Canadian provinces as a form of discrimination. In this case, though, the refusal to use female pronouns and designations for someone who was clearly female presenting and whom other newspapers identified as a trans woman seems to have been an expression not of biological fidelity, but of gynophilia, the compulsion to see women as purely good. The news story in question concerned a trans woman in a suburb of Phoenix, Arizona, who had killed her grandmother with a kitchen knife because, according to police, she was tired of looking after the elderly, dementia-suffering woman. The accused first beat the woman unconscious, then slit her throat in a bathtub. Such horrific violence is expected of a man, but almost unthinkable for a woman, even a trans woman. One of the defining features of our society, perhaps never before seen to this extent, is the enormous difficulty we have believing in female aggression and cruelty. It's as if our culture, once governed by reason, is now governed by a childlike terror at displeasing mother. We are generally hesitant to assign bad motives to women, reluctant to condemn women's choices or even to admit that women have choices, and eager to believe female self-justifications. Saying no to a woman has become almost completely socially unacceptable. This is sometimes linked to something called the "women are wonderful" effect, a phrase reportedly coined by research psychologists Alice Eagley and Antonio Mladinich, who compiled data showing that both females and males tend to have more positive associations with women than with men. Professor of psychology Roy Baumeister summed it up by saying that, quote, "both men and women hold much more favorable views of women than of men," end quote. Researchers have also confirmed a much higher in-group bias amongst women, meaning that women feel more empathy towards other women and men feel more empathy for women than for other men also. So powerful now is the belief in female goodness that a woman running for high office in the United States can allege with a straight face that women are better equipped than men to wield power simply because they don't have a penis, as did lesbian feminist Dana Nessel in her unabashedly chauvinistic campaign ad shown at the beginning of this video to be elected Attorney General for Michigan. Not surprisingly, perhaps, Nessel was successful in her bid. The valuing of women as the bearers of children has obvious biological utility. Most societies have valued women because the protection of women is necessary for group survival. But unlike most traditional gynocentric cultures, which plainly distinguished good women from bad, post-feminist Western cultures often demonstrate a striking inability to conceive of female evil at all, even when it stares us in the face. The impacts on law, public policy, and social practice are evident all around us. In 2012, Sonia Starr, a professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School, published the results of her study of discrepancies in criminal sentencing between men and women, showing a very large gender gap in punishment of women for the same crimes committed by men. Starr's study found an average 63% prison sentence gap advantaging women. She also discovered that, quote, female arrestees are significantly likelier to avoid charges and convictions entirely, and twice as likely to avoid incarceration if convicted, end quote. And it has been that way for some time. Over a century ago, E. Belfort Bax, a British barrister and journalist, discussed the bias in the criminal courts in favor of female lawbreakers, whether the crime be theft, fraud, common assault, criminal slander, or extremely serious crimes such as murder. In the latter case, he noted that, quote, the evidence, even to secure conviction of a woman, must be many times stronger than that which would suffice to hang a man. Should a conviction be obtained, the death penalty, though pronounced, is not given effect to, the female prisoner being almost invariably reprieved. In most cases where there is a conviction at all, it is for manslaughter and not for murder, end quote. Women who murdered their husbands could be exonerated with the allegation that their husbands had been abusive, an excuse that was never employed with any success for men who murdered their wives. At the time of Bax's writing, there was even a move afoot to have men tried as accessories in cases where a woman had killed her illegitimate child. In our own day, disbelief in female evil manifests in movements to keep all, or at least the vast majority of female wrongdoers out of prison altogether, with the rationale that women almost never act out of badness, only out of innocence warped by misogyny and abuse. An article by BBC News from September of 2018 quoted a prison reform advocate as saying that while prison was a negative experience for everyone, quote, it is particularly distressing for women, end quote. She went on to assert that women, quote, typically have more complex needs than men. They are more likely to be victims of abuse and more likely to have been sentenced for offending related to their exploitation by a partner, end quote. The reality is, as Sonia Starr alleged, that most men in prison also have backgrounds of deprivation and abuse, have mental health or addiction issues, and were influenced or exploited by others to take up their criminal path. But feminist advocates can peddle nearly any wonderful woman bigotry without fear of contradiction. The British Justice Secretary David Gauke was quoted in that same article as saying that female offenders were vulnerable people and that, quote, putting women into prison can do more harm than good for society, end quote. As a result, he pledged that the British government was shifting towards community services to keep women away from prison. Not a word was said in the article about keeping men out of prison, about male vulnerability, about men whose crimes were in some manner instigated, facilitated, or encouraged by their female partners, or about the number of incarcerated men who were abused in childhood, often by their mothers, the same mothers that everyone seems to want to keep out of prison so that they can, quote, care for their children. So deeply held is the idea that female wrongdoers are more sinned against than sinning, that in the United States, according to a recent article in the Atlantic magazine, many legal initiatives are being put in place to prevent so-called abuse victims, always conceived to be women, from going to prison for any crime, including murder, that can be understood to have been caused by their abuse or in some way aided or provoked by men. With the same reasoning, Canada in late 2014 recast prostitution law such that women's involvement is seen as non-criminal and pitiable, while men's is thought to deserve harsh punishment. The new law treats prostitution as a form of sexual exploitation of women and girls, making it illegal for men to buy sex or even to communicate for that purpose, while women can sell sex with impunity. The possibilities for criminal entrapment of men, for extortion and blackmail, and the incoherence and warped moral logic of the law itself are all glaring. But the law has widespread public and bipartisan political support as a measure to protect women. Even when women commit terrible acts of sexual abuse, our society reaches for narratives of expiation. Recently, a 40-year-old Nova Scotia woman who filmed on her own initiative her sexual abuse of her little boy and girl in order to share the videos with her male lover was given a far lighter sentence than the male lover who merely viewed the videos. She received a 9-year sentence in comparison with his 26 years, with her lawyer arguing that she suffered from PTSD as a result of various alleged childhood traumas. Whether the man in the story was traumatized in childhood or abused by his mother is of interest to no one. In delivering the sentence, the judge in the case accepted that, quote, there were aspects of the woman's background and psychological makeup that made her vulnerable to that situation, end quote, and the judge's last words to the woman reportedly expressed the hope that she would, quote, get some insight, end quote, into her actions. It's all too possible that any insight the woman finds will come from feminist propaganda that will tell her none of it was her fault. Heroic victimhood has become the favored stance of the modern woman, whether criminal or not, and it's easy to see why. Many of us harbor an inner child who longs to be praised for even the most banal of achievements and to be excused for even the most calculated of misdeeds. One can only speculate about the deep psychic damage to women of our cultural get-out-of-jail-free card. The cult of perpetual victimhood means that women are almost never held fully accountable by society and rarely take responsibility for their lives. One could even argue that our society is less interested in actually protecting women and girls than in strenuously denying female evil. A recent ruling in Ottawa, Ontario, saw a judge refuse to follow minimum sentencing guidelines for 2 convicted pimps because the pimps were women, even though their victims were vulnerable girls aged 14 and 15. The judge declared it, quote, cruel and unusual punishment, end quote, for the 2 women to receive the standard minimum sentence as they had, in his words, quote, only groomed their teenage victims and had not yet fully exploited them. Though the only reason they hadn't yet fully exploited the girls was that they were caught before they could. In his decision, the judge explained that the 2 women were themselves victims of the sex trade and were allegedly trying to turn their lives around. Only a brain addled by the women are wonderful effect could apply such reasoning to 2 adult women who ran a prostitution ring that forced young girls into the sex trade. So where are the outraged demonstrations? Where are the feminists standing up for brutalized female survivors? In cases where usually male judges give what are perceived to be too lenient sentences to male offenders, feminist activists agitate to have these judges disciplined or retrained or even removed from the bench. But what is to be done about judges who are overly lenient towards women? Very few people are willing to stand out in the rain with placards over that. As E. Belfort Bax noted in his discussion of gynocentric law, female wrongdoers tend to be, quote, surrounded by a halo of injured innocence, end quote, that neither they themselves nor the public are eager to dislodge. This is more than gynocentrism. It's something else, perhaps something unprecedented for which we have no name, involving an outright refusal to admit that women are capable of cruelty, viciousness, rage, selfishness, and destruction. Traditional gynocentric societies, while valuing women, tended to be deeply interested in understanding female evil and creating structures to control it. It's far past time we got serious about doing the same.